The Midrash Tanchuma on the word Shoftim B'Shotrim. You must install judges and law enforcers in your communities. Besides the Pasuk Tehillim, we say it every morning in the Halukas. He tells his words to Yaakov. What are they? Chukov Mishpatim Yisrael, his statutes and his laws to Yisrael. Dvorov, what's Dvorov? Elu Divrei Torah. Chukov Elu Medrashos. That's what's the interpretations. Umishpotov Elu Adinim. That's the dinim. Lo nosa Kodesh Baruch Hu es haTorah v'samishpotim Elu Yisrael b'vod. The Torah and the Mishpatim are only given to the Jewish people. Uminayin to Lamed. How do we know that the laws, dinim, and Torah are only given to the Jewish people? If a Jew and a non-Jew have a dispute or some kind of business issue between them, the Jew is not permitted to say to the non-Jew, let's go to your judges, to the secular court. Shu over belav. If he does, he's a violation of a lav, negative. Shenema lo osachen l'chol goy, mishpotim ha'idam ha'liyo. Says lo osachen l'chol goy. Mean our laws and the laws of the non-Jew are not the same. Some are asked, so the Medrash asks for lo umas olo nitztav al dinim. One of the seven mitzvahs Noach is dinim. They have to have a judicial system. So why are we permitted to go? They're obligated in dinim, in adjudicating disputes as we are. It's one of the seven Noahide laws. What does mean? The mishpotim bal yidom, they are not informed regarding mishpotim. Those are the aspects of judgment. What does this mean? We find that Ben Azai, when he would interrogate witnesses, and during the interrogation, he would ask him that where the event took place, the crime took place, could you tell me the stems of the figs? Could you tell me exactly what they looked like? That's part of the interrogation. And if the witnesses cannot respond, they're disqualified. A non-Jewish court, they're permitted to render judgment even if you have a single witness. If you have one dayan, even the person was not forewarned. Israel, which is not the case by a Jew. A Jew can only be judged. They have to meet all the criteria. It's a monetary law. You have to have 3 judges. You have to have a court of 23. If it's a question of death penalty, capital crimes. And a single witness has no credibility regarding testimony. And testimony is only valid only after interrogation. And it's specifically how you interrogate him. Kates of both Seidim, Mishnah Sanhedrin, you bring them and you tell them and you explain to them the ramifications, seriousness of their testimony. They ask him interrogation. There's 7 levels of questions. Be'ez yom, be'ez shua, be'ez chodesh. What day did it happen? What week was it? What month was it? Kama, what day? Be'ez shua, be'ez mokom. Makirnos atemoso. Did you forewarn him? He says, as the Gemara explains in Sanhedrin. Okay, let's stop for a moment. Therefore, what's required for a non-Jew, although it's one of the Shev Mitzvah in Noach, it's considered less than a semblance of what's required for a Jew to render a judgment. We have to meet all kinds of criteria. The court, the witnesses, how we evaluate evidence. Person has to be forewarned. Meaning it has to be beyond any doubt that the person was aware of the level of liability, that if he crosses those lines, otherwise he's not held accountable. There's no culpability in terms of at least the court. The court cannot render that verdict unless all these criteria are met. Therefore, this is what David means. Magid Vav Yaakov Chukam Mishpat L'Yisrael Umishpatim Bal Yudum. And these laws have no relevance, are not known to non-Jews, has no relevance to non-Jews. Therefore, a Jew cannot go to a non-Jewish court, because to be able to render a verdict, you have to meet different levels of criteria. Okay? That's Mishpat Yisrael. We'll see in a moment. Those who oversaw Klal Yisrael, they were praiseworthy because they made sure that the din, the law was, the courts were appropriate. Shmuel Ksiv, Volach Midei Shana B'Shana, V'Sova Beisel, V'Shover Yisrael. Shmuel would go, he would travel, and he would judge Klal Yisrael. Avdav L'Shtabech Alei Din, and David also is praised because of the way he instituted the court system. He keeps giving various references how these people were special because they made sure the din was appropriately adhered to and implemented. For a non-Jew to be found guilty, a single witness, no forewarning, a single judge, the person be related, all means nothing. By us, you have to meet endless criteria to establish first evidence. In addition, the judges to be qualified to render certain judgments, verdicts, they have to be qualified themselves, plus you have to have certain numbers. What's the reason? Now, firstly, the innate value. Now, who did Hashem create this world for? He created the world for the Jewish people. Bereshit bara Elokim. Bishvil Yisrael sheniqra reishis. Bishvil Torah sheniqra reishis. The Jewish people and the Torah are actually one and the same. We only have value if we're challenged by the laws which are explicit in the Torah, and this is the playing field. We meet all the challenges, and everything has to be implemented in this existence within the context of Torah. You meet the criteria of Torah, then this world has value. You don't, the world has no value. We were given the Torah at Sinai. Hashem says, either you accept the Torah, and if you don't, the world reverts back to pre-existence. What about the nations of the world? They have 7 Noahide laws. That's not what the creation is all about. We allow them to exist, but the world is not on their behalf. The world is for the Jewish people, that if they meet the challenge, the world continues. They don't meet the challenge, the world is destroyed. And the world rises and falls on the Jewish behavior, because everything is contingent on the adherence to the Torah. Now, judgment is essential, as I mentioned yesterday. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin that if a judge himself renders a corrupt judgment, Hashem says, Gemara quotes a pasuk, he says, I will take that person out. He will be taken out. I will take his life. Even if the judgment is as much as a penny. But yet, we asked, if a person steals an unlimited amount of money, Hashem doesn't say, I'm going to take the thief's life. He has obligations. He has to reimburse the person. He has to return the stolen object, the amount, whatever it may be. But the judge who renders a corrupt judgment, I will take his neshama. I will take his soul. And a judge who's done din emes lamito, it's Gemara in 2 locations, but a judge who renders a judgment which is emes lamito, doesn't say emes, it's a truthful judgment. It's the ultimate level of emes. So Tosas himself explains what's the meaning of emes lamito. Let's say the court, they interrogate, they meet all the criteria of what the Torah prescribes, and yet they feel that the evidence is something. They make it through the interrogation, but they feel these witnesses, there's something wrong with them. The judge has to disqualify himself. It has to be emes. Emes is not enough just to meet the criteria. but you have to have a sense that it's going to be a truthful verdict. And if you sense it's not, there's something not right, the judge has to disqualify himself, cannot rule on that. But the Gemara says, a dain who's done din emes lamito nasa shutiv ha'makadosh baruch hu ma'aseh bereshis. Hashem says, you're my partner in creation. However, if not, if you issue a corrupt judgment, not only you're not my partner in creation, I will take your life. Now, we mentioned yesterday that when Hashem created the world, he wanted to create the world midas adin. What's the midas adin? We're speaking about divine justice. But since he saw the world would not be able to survive divine justice, he coalesced into it midas harachmim. Midas harachmim. What's midas harachmim? Meaning, it's not as exacting as divine justice. But why is justice so important? Justice means if there are laws, there's an infrastructure, the world has to function within a certain profile of existence. Even though there's no divine justice, but there's human justice. Hashem says that I give over this responsibility of adjudicating cases and making sure the law is implemented. And there's justice within the context of the human being. That these are the terrestrial courts. But those courts have to meet the criteria of what the Torah prescribes. That's what the Torah says. Those are Dini Sanhedrin. So why is there no divine justice? Because the world will be destroyed. Why did Hashem give terrestrial justice? Because you have to have justice. Without justice, the world can't continue. What happens if the human judge, the terrestrial judge, courts are corrupted? So what does that mean? That means there's no justice. And the Medrash says, Hashem says, if there's no justice on the terrestrial level, then there must be divine justice. So if there's justice on the human level, on the terrestrial level, the words that are mentioned, im yesh din lamato and din lamalo. If there's justice on the terrestrial level, there's no heavenly justice, divine justice. But if it's ein din lamato, if there's no justice on the terrestrial level because the courts are corrupt, then there'll be midas adin, and therefore there'll be very, very serious, severe consequences because of this. So as a result of that, this is what the Gemara says. A dayan who's done emes lamito, the judge who rules the verdict is beyond any doubt truthful. You're Hashem's partner in creation. Why? Because the reason why the world continues is because terrestrial justice is being implemented correctly. So the world exists because there's justice. What happens if the courts are corrupt? That means there's no terrestrial justice. Hashem says, I will take your life. The man who steals, he's violating the Torah. But he's not responsible for justice. That's the court. So if the courts are in place, everything works. If the courts are not in place, even if they're corrupt, even to adjudicate a case which has almost no value, a penny, but that means that's a breach in justice. It's not being implemented. Once not implemented, then we talk about divine justice. We find that a Jew has an obligation, we're just learning Rabbi Yonah, there's a mitzvah, tzedek tishra misecho. A Jew has an obligation to give his fellow Jew the benefit of the doubt. It's a Torah obligation. So this is also, not only it's within the court system, does the court have to be appropriate and meet criteria, which the Torah prescribes. One Jew versus his fellow Jew has to also value and see that Jew within a certain context of evaluation. And we discussed, person is a middle-of-the-road Jew, and you see something which is a 50-50 call, you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. A tzaddik, who normally doesn't cross lines, and you see something which appears to be wrong, that he violated, you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. So it depends on the situation, how to evaluate it. But every one of these situations is is coined as B'tzem Tishma B'secho. We find by God's honest weights and measures. Also, Gemara tells us that a person who sells something and he has corrupt weights and measures, it's the equivalent of a corrupt judgment. And they're very severe consequences if weights and measures are not correct, because that's also, you're in a position to make an evaluation and you fail. The seller fails because he shortchanged the purchaser. And what's the liability? What's the consequence for false weights and measures? The Torah juxtaposes the coming Amalek to false weights and measures. Because you fail on that, as a dayan, the seller is the equivalent of a judge, making precise evaluations of what it is to sell, and you fall short of that, the seller is held accountable for that. It's the equivalent of a corrupt judgment. Now we quote Gemara Shav, Yerushalayim ultimately was destroyed because of corrupt. The courts were corrupt. You understand? It says explicitly it was because of the 3 cardinal sins. But yet we quote a pasuk that the pasuk says that Yerushalayim was destroyed because of Kilka Adin, Shenema Tmeas Hashem Rabbas Abhuma, Shem Shoy L'cha Al Adin Timeso. How do we understand it? The answer is, even if a person falls to the level of these 3 areas, but if you have terrestrial judgments, we still speak of Midas Arachmim. But if you fail even on that, then Hashem is going to rain in on you. So he rained in on all these areas only because there was no terrestrial justice. There's another very interesting medrash which the Chafetz Chaim cites about. He says, we know who was the advocate of the Jewish people. It was known that Rav Levi Yitzchak Barditchev, he was considered the advocate of Klal Yisrael. It was known that before Pesach, when he would supplicate Hashem on behalf of Klal Yisrael, because in Europe there was endless decrees against the Jews in Russia and Poland, and he would say that Jews, to be able to survive in Europe, they had no choice but to smuggle. They had to smuggle because the laws were so anti-Semitic that they had a different law for the Jew and a different law for the non-Jew. The taxes, a Jew was taxed differently than the Gentile. The tariffs that Jews had to pay were different tariffs than the non-Jew had to pay. So the only way you could survive was through not doing things correctly according to what the government demanded. They would smuggle. If a Jew would be caught smuggling, he could be put into prison, he could even be killed. But for the sake of survival, they had no choice. So the way he would advocate Hashem would be, he says, look, on Pesach, he says, the Torah says a Jew is not permitted to have in his domain chametz, even a small amount of chametz. You will go throughout the Jewish people, you will not find a morsel of chametz in their home. Although the liability is not the death penalty. But when it comes to smuggling, they're not concerned, they smuggle. So do you have a people like this? If you say you're not permitted to possess chametz, no Jew possesses chametz. But in regard to other areas, they turned their back on the law for the sake of survival. That was his advocacy for Klal Yisrael. So it's very interesting midrash over here. Midrash says, "V'shavtom mishpat tzedek." Shimatin es om kapskus. The court has to see the Jewish people in a positive light. Omre Yehuda Reb Sholom Shimatin Melamdim Leim Schus Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Gedolei Yisrael, the court, Gedolei Yisrael, Talmidei Chachamim, have to present the Jewish people for Hashem in the best light. We have to melamed schus on the Jewish people. Where do we learn this from? Gidon ben Yoash. In the time of Gidon, the Jews were surrounded by endless enemies, and we were about to be destroyed. Hashem was looking that there should be one individual who's going to put the Jews in a proper, see the Jews in a proper lens. Because the Jews were faltering in mitzvahs and in good deeds. The Jews were not honing up to the Torah. Despite that, Hashem wanted somebody should speak positive to the Jewish people. But Gidon, we'll see in a moment, he was not worthy that a Malach should communicate with him or should speak to him. But because Gidon went, he spoke positive about the Jewish people, despite the fact is that we're faltering in our spirituality. In mitzvahs, ma'asim tovim, Gidon found something to say positive about the Jewish people. Immediately, an angel appeared to him. And he says, go with your strength and you will destroy the enemy. What do I mean, lech b'kocha? Go with your power. You know what you have back in you? Your power lies is because since you put the Jews in a proper light, despite their failing, you found something good to say about them. Therefore, that schus will allow you to defeat your enemies. You know, you can always find fault. But Gedolei Yisrael, or Jews themselves, despite all our warts and failings, we have to try to speak positive about the Jews, despite everything. It's a known fact. The Gemara tells us that there are three characteristics which are innate to every Jew. What are they? Rachmanim, Baishanim, Gomlei Chasodim. This is something we have. This is in our DNA. We have from the other side of the ocean. Rachmanim, we have mercy. We have conscience, and we do Gemilas Chesed. It's a known fact that there's no people on the face of the earth who are as charitable as the Jewish people, per capita. Jews are charitable. Jews have compassion and mercy. Jews have conscience. The world does not have that. So even though today Jews are assimilating, Jews are due to lack of Jewish education, whatever it may be. But there's plenty good to say about the Jewish people, despite all the shortcomings. So why talk about the negative if you can talk about the positive? Here Hashem says you should judge them mishpat tzedek. Hashem says, speak positive about my children. Don't speak negatively about them. And if you do, even though you're not worthy, and the Jews are not worthy, they will merit a special siyata d'shmaya, a special divine intervention that Hashem will go to bat for us. Because Hashem wants to hear something positive about his children. God knows all the shortcomings. But he wants us to speak. Despite that, if there's something positive to say it. Why? The prosecutor's always gunning first. There's something, always. He keeps shutting down something, but after all, he can't shut him down. But if we ourselves go and we find merit in the Jewish people, then Hashem says, you see, this is the merit. My children, in spite of all the shortcomings, they all speak positively. If that's the case, you have no right to prosecute them. And the Chofetz Chaim cites this in one of his Svarim. This Chazal here in the Medrash in this week's Parsha. Nosate mishpot. Nosake ponim. You should not corrupt the law. You should not recognize. I mean, there should be no favoritism within justice. Lo sikach shochat, and you're not permitted to take bribery. Because bribery blinds the eyes of the wise, and it corrupts righteous laws. Let's see Rashi. Lo sater kimashmo lo sakeponim. What does it mean? You should not show any favoritism. We're not even talking about when you give the verdict, because one person has a relation with the judge, he favors that person. But even when you're interrogating the witnesses, when you're receiving testimony, each person comes to court, he has to present his case. Let's say the defendant has a feeling that the judge is favoring one of the defense over him. The other person immediately, he shuts down. He doesn't present his case entirely because he feels it's a lost cause. So it's not only when you have all the evidence, you can't give a corrupt verdict knowing it's not correct because you're favoring one person, but even when you're evaluating, when you're interrogating, when you're listening, receiving the case itself, you can't act soft to one and stern to the other one. One person says sit, and the other person stands. Because if he sees that the dayan is favoring his fellow defendant, he immediately shuts down. He doesn't express himself. He doesn't present his case correctly because he feels and maybe it's a lost cause. Even to what? To give a correct judgment. What does that mean? Even if the judge is giving a correct judgment, what do you mean lo sikach shochat? How do you understand that? Let's say you have a case like this. You have two people. Somebody says to the judge, you see this poor guy, I know you're inclined to favor the rich guy. So if you rule correctly and you treat the poor man no less than the rich man, I will give you something. So the verdict is given correctly, but what was the impetus? That he should not be biased. He's being paid. So even though the mishpat is mishpat tzedek, but since it came as a result of bribery, it's not valid. Explain this, but the question is why. So now he's not intimidated by the wealthy man, or he has no reason to favor the wealthy man, because ultimately, when he rules properly for the poor man, he's going to give a correct ruling. So why is it not valid? If he takes shochat, it's not a valid judgment. Because he's only giving that ruling because he's being paid. Even it's mishpat tzedek. How do we understand it? So Rashi says, the moment he takes the bribery, he's no longer impartial. He loses his impartiality the moment he takes the bribe. He's looking in a way to find favor in the other person the moment he takes the bribery. But there's a case where it's impossible to know which person's right, and it's up to the judge to throw the case in whichever he wants. It's not based on a rational. This is case and situation. Whoever the judge wants to give rule for, he can. Not based on anything. You have two documents. and the document, the sale closes at the end of the date in the document, and you have two documents identical, and it says the person sold property to Reuven, he sold the same property to Shimon. To Reuven, sold it to Shimon, and he sold it to Levi. So the Gemara says, what do you do there? Shuda the dining. It's called the toss of a coin. The way Tosas learns. Toss of a coin. So Tosas asks the question, if it's a toss of a coin, it's not based on any rational evaluation whatsoever. It's just a toss of a coin. So why can't the judge take bribery for that? One of the defendants say, look, something, it's toss a coin. It's not based on who's right or wrong. It's whatever you want to do. I'll pay you off and rule in my favor. Let the coin go in my direction. That's Tosas' question.
Yeah, so because if you do that, even if in this one case you have
ruling of Shuda Daini, whatever the flip of a coin, that verdict, a court has to issue that ruling. What is a court comprised of? Dayanim. To be a qualified judge, what do you have to be? You know what you have to be? Unbiased. You have to be impartial. The moment you take the bribe, you lose your status as a dayan. A dayan has to be impartial. The moment you take that bribe, you're no longer impartial. But it's not based on impartiality or not. It doesn't make a difference, but you're not a judge. The psak, the ruling, the verdict of Shuda Daini is by the Bezdin. Who issues the verdict of a Bezdin? A dayan. But if you've lost your qualification as a dayan, so if that's the case, the verdict's not a verdict. You understand? Even though the ruling is not based on objectivity or anything here, the Torah says, what is a judge? A judge has to be impartial to both defendants, regardless. The moment you lose that impartiality, you're no longer a dayan. If you're no longer a dayan, you don't qualify to give the ruling. Person is objective. Could a person be totally objective? What do you say? Could a person be totally objective? When we speak about total objectivity, it's all based on relative. Relative, what's not objective, this person is totally objective. But it's impossible to be totally objective. Why? Because our lives have many influences in them. And because of the influences, our background, our experiences have bearing or have effect the way we see things. So we see, yes, total objectivity. There's no such thing as total objectivity. Within human experience, the person is, relatively speaking, he's totally objective. The only one who's totally objective on an absolute level is Hashem. Because Hashem is the only one who's not affected. He affects, he's not affected. The court itself, it says, El Kim Nitza B'das Kale. If you meet the criteria of what a Bezdin is, then Hashem convenes with that court. The judges see and evaluate the evidence through the eyes of God. If Hashem is convening with the court, who is God? Totally impartial on the absolute level. So whatever is considered impartial on a human level, you have to meet that criteria of impartiality. The moment you're no longer a court. That's the reason why that's crucial, this impartiality, because otherwise it's not, so therefore it's not relevant if you give a correct judgment or not a correct judgment. Because every judgment, to be a judgment, Hashem has to convene with the court. If you don't meet the criteria of that, God doesn't convene. If it doesn't convene, you might as well go to a non-Jewish court. Because Hashem doesn't convene with the non-Jewish court. They have different standards. A single judge, a single witness, without being forewarned, all this. But for the Jew, it's the Torah. And when you meet all the criteria of the Torah, what a court is, El Kim Nitza B'das Kale. That's the understanding.